and I say a little workshop because when you start to analyse anything as large, as devastating as the First World War, you could go on for days talking about it. So what we've actually done is picked out bits and pieces from here and there, and we hope to present you a reasonable workshop in the next hour or so. The poster that you're looking at there is probably one of the most famous posters in the world. And hands up anybody who's never seen that poster? Nobody, there you are. I was supposed to hold it up here, but some lunatics taped it to them, so I didn't feel like holding the box up. The whole point being, of course, that it still works today because you're here. I mean, it worked in 1914 to the tune of 5 million men, and that's what we're going to talk about as well. So, welcome to the start of the workshop. I'll give a bit of an introduction first, and then we'll get into it, as they say. Maybe I should just introduce the people around me first as well. My good friends who've been subjected over the last couple of months to a lot of hard work, let's say. Peter Day, Kate Burke, Dave Moss on the trumpet at the back, a minor part but a big voice, Jenny Arger, Arthur Bowers, George Cockram, Brendan O'Brien, Judith Crossley, and of course Francis Bartholomeusz. So there we go. That's who it's doing, and here we go into the workshop. Now, 80 years ago, the First World War broke out. Now, this workshop isn't the history of that war, though it covers some of the things and events that took place in chronological order. The workshop is about the young men who fought in the war, ordinary civilians, answering their country's call, wanting to get the job done and going home to resume a normal life again. Of course, for most of the survivors, life was never the same again. When we read official histories of World War I, there is a detached, matter-of-fact style about them. It is only when reading frontline soldiers' and officers' accounts we get a clearer picture of what events took place. It's from these sources that we're able to present this workshop, using the poetry recitations of the British Tommy of 1914-18. I'd like to acknowledge the following sources in the books: The Long Trail, John Brophy and Eric Partridge; Somme, Lynn MacDonald; World War I, Grace P. Hayes; and the poetry Men Who March Away, I.M. Parsons. Now, you'll probably recognise some of the songs that will be sung, and we'd like you to join in with them. Of course, it's only natural you'd want to, wouldn't you? And they all cried enthusiastically, yes! Did I hear yes? Good! However, between performances of individual artists or all together, I'd ask you, as brilliant as our performance may or may not be, I'd ask you to refrain from clapping, because what we want to do is get the continuity of the thing going, and if we clap for sometimes a ditty that is 2 lines long, you know, we're going to be here as long as the First World War, so we'll get on with it. So, ladies and gentlemen, out of the trenches.
The going down of the sun and twilight's fading fast brings thoughts and memories of things long gone and past.
The 1914-18 war was the most horrific conflict the world had seen. Perhaps the most striking thing about it was the futility of it all. The enormous waste of men and material in a war that settled nothing. Millions of people were killed, and on the Western Front alone, 2.5 million British soldiers were casualties. More than 900,000 were killed. 5 out of 9 soldiers were casualties. But if only troops in the forward areas are taken into account, then it is probable that 8 out of 9 became casualties. The war was a war not only of physical endurance, but of nervous and moral endurance. In 1914 and early 1915, men were so eager to enlist that the Army's organisation was overwhelmed and didn't have the resources to equip the volunteers. Many thought the war would be over by Christmas. The soldiers went to war singing popular songs of the music halls, Probably the most famous one in 1914 was It's a Long Way to Tipperary, written in 1912 by Jack Judge, a music hall performer. Well, in the 1970s, folk singer Bill Caddock wrote The Writing of Tipperary, which deals with the history of how that song was written and also covers the events in world history just prior to the war. Here is that song.
I'd just like to say that this is the only contemporary song we'll be using in the workshop. King Edward VII, who some called the Peacemaker, died in 1910. He was buried at Windsor, and in the procession were the finest and highest of men. There were 9 crowned kings and 30 proud princes, leaders of many the land. And old Kaiser Bill rode next to King George, with his field marshal's baton in hand. Crippen was caught that very same year, as Halley's comet flashed by, and the first of the Labour exchanges was opened the year the old king died. The Sydney Street Siege started in 1911, when anarchy died in the flames. In London in June, King George and his queen played the coronation game. A place in the sun, said the Kaiser in Hamburg, launching his new battleships. King George made India, Ireland and Wales the places for right royal trips. Titanic was launched on the day of the Derby. London's last horse bus was shown, and the suffragettes mustered, demanding their rights, and in came 1912. Jack Judge went down into West Bromwich town to welcome the brand new year. Popped in the pub just to have a little sup, 'cause he liked his drop of beer. And when he'd had a drink, well, he started to sing, and his voice, it lifted high. Me name's Jack Judge, I can write you a song, and from Albury town come I. Me name's Jack Judge, I can write you a song, and from Albury town come I. Now a Brummagem feller who was sitting close by had heard what Jack did say. A pound to a penny, he says to Jack, that Jack could write a song in a day. Jack had her to laugh, and he had her to drink, and he said, I'll take you on. This afternoon I'll write you a song and sing it for the day is done. This afternoon I'll write you a song and sing it for the day is done. Had her to laugh, and he sang another tune, and he bought another beer. And he caught the train to Staley Bridge that night he was due to appear. That very first day of 1912, old Jack Judge won his bet. And the song he made and he sang that day we never shall forget. The song he made and he sang that day we never shall forget. In March 1912, brave Scott and his comrades died while the snowstorm roared. And later that year, the good General Booth, he finally laid down his sword. There were riots in Ireland concerning Home Rule. Mrs. Pankhurst was in prison again. And Wilbur Wright died, that first among flyers, as the Royal Flying Corps was named. Titanic, she sank in the spring of that year, taking 1,500 lives. And the Balkan states blazed from border to border as death began sharpening its knives. Of the 1910 monarchs who mourned for King Edward, in 1913 few survived. They'd sooner had lived to a peaceful old age, but assassins took many the life. Death came calm to China and Sweden, where elsewhere the murderer's hand struck the Pasha of Turkey, the king of the Greeks, while Spain survived its plan. And the armies of Europe paraded and postured, stockpiled armed weapons increased, and at The Hague, as if In grim desperation, they opened the Palace of Peace. As suffragettes seethed, in came 1914, an Austrian Archduke was slain. In less than 2 months, all Europe was marching. Death was in business again. And many's the young man from many's the family, willingly gave us all. And they died in their millions for a dubious victory, answering Kitchener's call. And as they rode off to war in their trains and their troop ships, they sang as they hurried along. And the words echo back to the graveyards of Flanders, singing out Jack Judge's song. Yes, the words echo back to the graveyards of Flanders, singing out Jack Judge's song. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye Piccadilly, farewell Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, my heart's right there.
Well, it didn't take long for the optimistic young men who went to the front in 1914 to realise that the war would not be over by Christmas. And before the end of 1914, they had had enough of Tipperary. Attempts to start it were often howled and whistled down, although civilians retained their affection for it. The troops did little or no singing while in the trenches. However, coming out after a tour of duty was a different matter. Nerves began to relax after days or weeks of tension, and as soon as the company had a mile or two of road behind them, a kind of sotto voce singing or some sort of soft whistling would begin. The tune was all that mattered then, not the words.
John Brown's baby's got a pimple on his. John Brown's baby's got a pimple on his. John Brown's baby's got a pimple on his, and the poor kid can't sit down. Usually soldiers would put words to a well-known tune. That way it was learned very quickly. John Brown's Body is a good example, as you've just heard. The troops sang many songs that could not be printed in those days. However, they were passed on from unit to unit and eventually back to Britain and into the school playgrounds, so that the youngsters could learn with interest the songs of their fathers. It's called passing on the tradition. Remember the song Mademoiselle from Armentières? Well, the original version went, Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières hadn't been kissed for 50 years, inky pinky parlez-vous? Well, that was the original version, as I say. But the troops preferred other variations. This is one of them. A German officer crossed the line, parlez-vous? A German officer crossed the line, parlez-vous? A German officer crossed the line to shag the women and drink the wine, inky pinky parlez-vous? And it gets worse. However, no one in their right mind would claim responsibility for writing that. But it was still alive and well in the schoolyard when I was a kid. So most of the soldiers' songs that we're presenting are anonymous. When we attempt to understand what those young men had to face in that war, it becomes clearer why those songs were sung. It helped to keep their spirits up. The class structure of Britain separated the ordinary ranks from the officers. So on the one hand, we have the songs and humour of Tommy Atkins, and on the other, the poetry of the officers. Popular with the troops was the showman. It's pre-war, but many soldiers learned this by heart to recite.
First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I trust you ladies will forgive my French. We have the chemis. Well, the shameless chemis. They jumped from precipice to precipice and back to piss again. Ah, the rhinoceros, the richest animal in the world. To those familiar with the classics, the derivations of his name is interesting. Rhino, meaning money. Sore arse, meaning piles. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, piles of money. And next, the leopard. One spot for every day of the year. What about a leap year, Bill? Just lift his tail. This is the laughing hyena. The animal drinks once a week, eats once a month, and he never has sexual intercourse. So what's he got to laugh at? I don't know. Here is the wild man of Borneo. He has no cock. How does he do it, Governor? He can't. That's what makes him so bloody wild. Have you seen him? I will now show you the camel. This peculiar animal eats mud. He shits bricks. He has a triangular arsehole, hence the pyramids. We now come to the woo-hoo bird. He eats peppers, flies backwards, hence the trade winds. Woo-hoo! Here we have the Wagga Wagga bird. He scours the local villages in search of his prey. On finding the finest specimen of the female of his species, he carries her off to his mountain lair, where he proceeds to, while uttering in his plaintive cry of Wagga Wagga, this being interpreted from the language of the bird, that signifies, oh God, how lovely. The armoured armadillo. This is an extraordinary beast. When pursued by his foes, does he run away? No. Does he climb trees? No. He retreats and farts. Woo. Defiance at his nonplus foes. And finally, we have the Ouslam bird. This bird, ladies and gentlemen, once a year descends from his mountain fastness into the valleys below. He then stalks to the villages. There he finds the fairest and most virtuous of the opposite sex. There he does it to her, and finally eats her, thus avoiding for his unfortunate victim the shame and disgrace which otherwise be her lot. Now then, you young boys, get in the boats. The elephant's about to piss.
And now a poem by Charles Sawley, an infantry officer who was killed at the Battle of Lewes, 1915, aged 20. All the hills and vales along.
All the hills and vales along, earth is bursting into song, and the singers are the chaps who are going to die, perhaps. Oh, sing, marching men, till the valleys ring again. Give your gladness to earth's keeping, so be glad when you are sleeping. Cast away regret and rue, think what you are marching to. Little live, great pass. Jesus Christ and Barabbas were found the same day. This died, that went his way. So sing with joyful breath, for why? You are going to death. Teeming earth will surely store all the gladness that you pour. Earth that neither doubts nor fears, earth that knows of death, not tears. Earth that bore with joyful ease hemlock for Socrates, earth that blossomed and was glad neath the cross that Christ had, shall rejoice and blossom too when the bullet reaches you. Wherefore, men, marching on the road to death, sing, pour your gladness on earth's head. So be merry, so be dead. From the hills and valleys earth shouts back the sound of mirth, tramp of feet and lilt of song, ringing all the road along. all the music of their going, ringing, swinging, glad song throwing, earth will echo still when foot lies numb and voice mute. On, marching men, on to the gates of death with song. Sow your gladness for earth's reaping, so you may be glad though sleeping. Strew your gladness on earth's bed, so be merry, so be dead.
A young officer in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment understood the British Tommy completely. He was the creator of Old Bill, Bruce Burns' father, who probably did more to keep spirits up than any other single person during the war. The Bystander magazine, which featured Old Bill and his mates, struck a chord with the men in the trenches. They could see themselves in Burns' father's cartoons. And I'd like to show you a couple of examples of his work, because he was very, very popular with the troops. And this is very typical of... I've blown it up a bit. Can you all see that? As you can see, it's a completely bombed-out building, and these darker objects, because I've come up so good on the photocopier, are dead cows, and there's a cat and there's a pair of clogs, and it's completely devastated. And, of course, this guy's writing, and he put, "Dear Mother, at present we are staying on a farm." And that's so typical of Ben's father's work. There's another classic one, which is one of my favourites. You may not see this one so clearly, so I'll explain it, but... It's difficult, but what it basically is a night with a few stars, and there's a little bit of a moon there, and there's a sentry on the parapet here, you see, and over there, you can't see, is a shape. That's he of the bundle. Now, this fella's obviously been looting, somewhere in the middle of the night, and it's called No Possible Doubt Whatever, the caption. It's got sentry, so the sentry on the thing says, "Halt! Who goes there?" And he of the bundle says, "You shut your sodding mouth or I'll bloody well knock your bleeding head off." Sentry, pass friend. And that is so typical of Ben's father's cartoons. And he put out these wonderful magazines, and well, you may or may not be familiar with his work, but I think of the time he did keep the spirits up of a lot of those young blokes who are over there. Anyway, Bruce Ben's father's work there. Of course, Bruce Ben's father was not well liked in the higher circles of the military, they reckon he made the British soldier look ridiculous. But there's many a Ben's father original hanging in the homes of the descendants of the generals who disliked him.
Well, the war wasn't over by Christmas 1914, but something did happen on Christmas Day that year. A young officer in the Scots Guards noticed 4 Germans get out of their trenches and walk across no man's land towards the British lines. He sent 2 of his own men to meet them, unarmed, as the Germans were unarmed. The Germans were 3 private soldiers and a stretcher bearer. Their spokesman said they thought it only right to come over and wish everyone a happy Christmas. After some discussion, the men returned to their lines, and the British officer went to report the incident at headquarters. On his return at 10 a.m, he could hear singing, with not a British soldier left in the trenches. To his amazement, he saw hundreds of British and German troops mixing out in no man's land, all down the line. The same thing was happening. Every sort of souvenir was being exchanged, and the men were singing everything from Auld Lang Syne to Christmas carols, and all were joining in. The unofficial Christmas truce finished at midnight and was never to happen again. The generals on both sides made sure of that. At least that's the official account of events. But a reliable report elsewhere claims that again on Christmas Day 1915 there was another incident of fraternization when some guardsmen and some Germans met in a friendly way. This was never reported in the newspapers, and a young officer was sent home in disgrace.
During 1915, 2 songs emerged as favourites with the troops: the American "The Long Trail" and "Keep the Home Fires Burning." Here we see the first lightsome, unembittered emotions of homesickness inlaid in "Keep the Home Fires Burning."
Keep the home fires burning.
dark clouds inside out, till the boys come home. There's a silver lining through the dark clouds shining. Turn the dark clouds inside out, till the boys come home. Of course, soldiers were still producing their own brand of song as well, and nothing was sacred. The Scottish Bring Back My Bonnie to Me was used for Barney and Sergeant Sergeant.
I took my girl for a ramble all down a shady lane. She caught her foot in a bramble, and there's over bollock she came. Oh Barney, oh Barney, oh bring back my Barney to me, to me. Barney, oh Barney, oh bring back my Barney to me. Another variation went, oh Sergeant, oh Sergeant, oh bring back my rations to me. Mounted units had several versions of which, Sergeant, Sergeant, bring back my stirrups to me, to me. Sergeant, oh Sergeant, oh bring back my stirrups to me. I stuck it as long as I could. I stuck it as long as I could. Sergeant, oh Sergeant, my bollocks are not made of wood.
Even nursery rhyme tunes were used. Three Blind Mice, for instance, finished up as My Nellie's a whore. My Nellie's a whore. My Nellie's a whore. She's got such wonderful eyes of blue. She uses such wonderful language too. Her favourite expression is bollocks to you. My Nellie's a whore. The word bollocks features in songs almost to the point of lunacy, I'd have to add. Listen to this. Tiddlywinks, old man, get a woman if you can. If you can't get a woman, do without. Old man, when the Rock of Gibraltar takes a flying leap to mortar, when you never get your bollocks in a corned beef can. I mean, is there any logic in that at all? Absolutely not, as far unless it's perhaps they wonder what they were getting instead of corned beef in the tins. You never know, do you? Of course, and sergeants feature a lot as well, usually in a derogatory sense, as this song illustrates.
We got the sergeant major who's never seen a gun. He's mentioned in dispatches for drinking private's rum. And when he sees old Jerry, you could see the bugger run miles and miles and miles behind the lines.
Well, 1915 passed, and the two sides were still facing each other across no man's land. So the British generals planned a major offensive for summer 1916. The Battle of the Somme was the most meticulously planned campaign in modern warfare. But for the generation of young men who had so enthusiastically joined up in 1914, it became a baptism of fire. By the time it was over, 150,000 lay dead and 300,000 were maimed or wounded.
Battalions on the march were encouraged to sing by their colonel. However, the commander-in-chief himself took a priggish interest in the songs warbled by his now largely youthful army. It was rumoured that General Haig found even the official version of Mademoiselle from Armentières offensive to his well-bred ears, even though it had already become popular in the most respectable circles at home. The Tommies, however, preferred the infinite variations of less respectable versions, and the younger ones in particular, newly drafted into France and into the ranks of the fighting battalions, were at first aghast, then amazed, then in most cases delighted at the bawdy Freemasonry of which they had so suddenly become a part. Some schoolboy faces, unable to cast off their rigid and sheltered upbringing, blushed, stayed silent, and as hymn tunes had been so frequently adopted to accompany words that were less than religious in feeling, worried on occasion that the whole blasphemous battalion might be struck down by an avenging thunderclap from above. General Haig was more concerned with moral tone than with avenging thunderclaps. No battalion would have ventured to march to a ribald song within miles of his headquarters. No colonel within a considerable radius of any spot where there was a likelihood of meeting a staff officer would have allowed his battalion to march, even in the heat of an August day, with tunics undone, shirt buttons loosened, and still less would he have relieved his own sweltering discomfort by replacing his stiff army hat with a khaki handkerchief knotted on each corner in the style of a day tripper to the beach at Southend. It is unfortunate for one particular battalion marching towards the Somme that it happened to present precisely this appearance as it passed through a village where a senior ordnance officer had his headquarters. It was unfortunate that the commander-in-chief, concerned about supplies of ammunition for the coming push, should have been visiting the Ordnance HQ in person. Unfortunate, too, that the battalion should have been in full vocal flood and rendering a particular chorus compared to which the bawdiest version of Mademoiselle from Armentières might have been considered a suitable serenade for a maiden aunt. Do your balls hang low? Do you tangle to and fro? Can you tie 'em in a knot? Can you tie 'em in a bow? They had reached the fourth line before the full sense of the words got through to the commander-in-chief. It got worse as he listened. Do they itch when it's hot? Do you rest 'em in a pot? He crossed to the window and stared in disbelief as the unwitting battalion shambled past. Just as I thought, he said, it's the rear companies. Fetch my horse. The battalion straggled, easy marching, over almost a mile of road. By the time Sir Douglas Haig had mounted and started to trot up the long common, they had started all over again, this time in harmony, because the beauty of their favourite song was the fact that it could be sung in parts. Do you get 'em in a tangle? Do you catch 'em in the mangle? Do they swing in stormy weather? Do they tickle with a feather? One by one, as the marching platoons spotted the unmistakable upright figure of their commander-in-chief, trotting purposefully past to reach the head of the battalion, their voices trailed away into embarrassed silence. But the men at the head of the column were still lustily singing. Do they rattle when you walk? Do they jingle when you talk? The colonel had a fine voice. Riding in front of his battalion, he was singing louder than any of his men, so loudly that he either failed to notice the falling off of the merry chorus behind him, or, putting it down to fatigue, sang louder than ever to encourage his men across the last lap of the hour's march. Just as General Haig caught up with him, he had flung back his handkerchiefed head and was bawling a rousing, oblivious crescendo. Can you sling 'em on your shoulder like a lousy fucking soldier? Do your balls hang low? Haig had to shout to make himself heard. I must congratulate you on your voice, Colonel. The unfortunate colonel could only stare back open-mouthed, fumble at his unbuttoned tunic, call the battalion to march to attention, and, as an afterthought, snatch the handkerchief from his head. No, no, Haig raised his hand. The men may march easy. With the last of his voice, the colonel croaked the command. Haig, on his great black charger, a full hand higher than the colonel's horse, trotted beside him and bent down for a private word in the colonel's ear. But his orderly, riding just behind, heard and later reported every word. I like the tune, he said, but you must know that in any circumstances those words are inexcusable. The discomfited colonel, having now replaced his hat, managed to salute, but before he could stammer an apology, Haig was gone with a final nod of rebuke, trotting back past the chastened battalion to resume his interrupted business. It was a full 5 minutes before anyone broke the silence. Then a wag halfway down the column dared to introduce another song. It was a song beloved by their virtuous Victorian grandmothers, and he sang it in notes of pure innocence. After the ball was over. The battalion exploded, and those of them who were capable of joining in, joined in. So on they went, accepting their lot, and including in their repertoire a song that seemed to echo their thoughts.
Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you've a Lucifer to light your fag,
Smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So, pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
On the Somme in 1916, battalions which were 800 to 900 strong at dawn were reduced by afternoon to 100 men.
The General by Siegfried Sassoon. Good morning, the General said when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of 'em dead, and we're cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack, as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both by his plan of attack.
If you want to find the sergeant, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the sergeant, I know where he is. He's lying on the canteen floor. I've seen him, I've seen him. He's lying on the canteen floor. I've seen him lying on the canteen floor. If you want to find the quarter bloke, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the quarter bloke, I know where he is. He's miles and miles behind the line. I've seen him, I've seen him. He's miles and miles behind the line. I've seen him miles and miles behind the line. If you want to find the sergeant major, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the sergeant major, I know where he is. He's boozing up the private's rum. I've seen him, I've seen him. He's boozing up the private's rum. I've seen him boozing up the private's rum. If you want to find the CO, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the CO, I know where he is. He's down in the deep dugouts. I've seen him, I've seen him. He's down in the deep dugouts. I've seen him down in the deep dugouts. If you want to find the old battalion, I know where they are. I know where they are. I know where they are. If you want to find the old battalion, I know where they are. They're hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen 'em, I've seen 'em. They're hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen 'em hanging on the old barbed wire.
Base Details by Siegfried Sassoon. If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with my puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the Roll of Honour. Poor young chap, I'd say. I used to know his father well. Yes, we've lost heavily in this last scrap. And when the war is done and youth stone dead, I'd toddle safely home and die in bed.
Well, the truth was that by the end of 1916, Britain had sacrificed the best of its young men for very little gains, and the British Tommy was aware of it.
Two of the most famous of the soldiers' songs were I Don't Want to Die and When This Lousy War Is Over. I want to go home. I want to go home. I don't want to go in the trenches no more, where whiz-bangs and shrapnel lay whistle and roar. Take me over the sea, where the alley men can't get at me. Oh my, I don't want to die, I want to go home.
When this lousy war is over, no more soldiering for me. I will get my civvy clothes on. Oh, how happy I will be. People said when we enlisted, fame and medals we would win. But the fame is in the guard room, and those medals made of tin. So when this lousy war is over, no more soldiering for me. I will get my civvy clothes on. Oh, how happy I will be. No more standing to in trenches. Only one more church parade. No more NCOs to curse us, and no more Tickler's marmalade. So when this lousy war is over, no more soldiering for me. I will get my civvy clothes on. Oh, how happy I will be.
1917 was rich in songs of absence and longing for home. It is easy to see where the soldiers' hearts lay.
Oh, carry me back to dear old Blighty. Put me on the train to London town. Take me over there, drop me anywhere. Birmingham, Leeds or Manchester, well, I don't care. I'd just like to see my best girl. Cuddling up again we soon would be. Oh,
Itey tiddly itey, carry me back to Blighty. Blighty is the place for me.
Jack Dunn, son of a gun, over in France one day, keeps fit, doing his bit, up to his eyes in clay. Every night, after a fight, to pass the time away, he gets his little gramophone and plays this song. Carry me back to dear old Blighty, put me on the train to London town. Take me over there, drop me anywhere. Birmingham, Leeds or Manchester, well, I don't care. I'd just like to see my best girl. Cuddling up again we soon would be. Oh, itey tiddly itey, carry me back to Blighty. Blighty is the place for me.
Blighty was, of course, home, and there were two ways of getting there: by leave or by being wounded badly enough to be sent home. Men considered themselves lucky if they received a Blighty wound. In some cases, the strain of life in the front line was just too much, as in Siegfried Sassoon's poem, Suicide in the Trenches.
I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cowed and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go.
Sassoon was one of the war's finest poets, of course. As an infantry officer, he saw the carnage firsthand. And his poem Blighters explains his feelings whilst attending a show in London on leave.
The house is crammed. Tier beyond tier, they grin and cackle at the show, while prancing ranks of harlots shrill the chorus, drunk with din. We're sure the Kaiser loves our dear old tanks. I'd like to see a tank come down the stalls, lurching to ragtime tunes, or Home, Sweet Home. And there'd be no more jokes in music halls to mock the riddled corpses round Bapaume.
The carnage continued through 1917 with the great battles of Arras and Passchendaele. The ground turned into a stinking morass, impossible to walk on without the use of duckboards. So, in the horror that was Flanders, men fulfilled their duty to king and country. Some were blown to pieces, some went mad, many fell into shell holes filled with mud and water where they drowned.
A poem by Siegfried Sassoon, The Redeemer. Darkness. The rain sluiced down, the mire was deep. It was past 12 on a midwinter night, when peaceful folks in bed lay snug asleep. There, with much work to do before the light, we lugged our clay-sucked boots as best we might along the trench. Sometimes a bullet sang, and droning shells burst with a hollow bang. We were soaked, chilled and wretched, every one. Darkness, the distant wink of a huge gun. I turned in the black ditch, loathing the storm. A rocket fizzed and burned with blanching flare, and lit the face of what had been a form floundering in murk. He stood before me there, and I say that he was Christ, stiff in the glare, and leaning forward from his burdening task, both arms supporting it. His eyes on mine stared from a woeful head that seemed a mask of mortal pain in hell's unholy shine. No thorny crown, only a woolen cap he wore, an English soldier, white and strong, who loved his time like any simple chap. Good days of work and sport and homely song. Now he has learned that nights are very long, and dawn a watching of the windowed sky. But to the end unjudging, he'll endure horror and pain, not uncontent to die, that Lancaster on Lune may stand secure. He faced me, reeling in his weariness, shouldering his load of planks so hard to bear. I say that he was Christ, who wrought to bless all groping things with freedom bright as air, and with his mercy washed and made them fair. Then the flames sank, and all grew black as pitch, while we began to struggle along the ditch, and someone flung his burden in the muck, mumbling, "Oh, Christ Almighty, now I'm stuck."
Raining, 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 always bloody well raining, raining all the morning and raining all the night. Grousing, 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 always bloody well grousing, grousing at the rations and grousing at the pay. Marching, 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 always bloody well marching. When the war is over, we'll damn well march no more. In March 1918, the German army began their own offensive and forced the British back to where they were in 1914. But the Germans had lost heavily and could go no further. Also, a new player was about to enter on the side of the Allies, America. America poured into France 1 million men. This decided the issue, and on the 11th of November 1918, the war to end all wars was over. At one hospital in France, a Scottish RAMC officer recklessly signed an order which was duly posted in the ward declaring, to celebrate the conclusion of hostilities, every patient will be allowed an extra piece of bread and jam with his tea.
It seemed appropriate to conclude this workshop with a poem by Osbert Sidwell, another First World War soldier poet. It's called The Next War, and he wrote this in November 1918, and it shows a remarkable insight into the future.
The long war had ended. Its miseries had grown faded. Deaf men became difficult to talk to, and heroes became bores. Those alchemists who had converted blood into gold had grown elderly. But they held a meeting, saying, "We think perhaps we ought to put up tombs or erect altars to those brave lads who were so willingly burnt or blinded or maimed, who lost all likeness to a living thing, or were blown to bleeding patches of flesh for our sakes. It would look well, or we might even educate the children." But the richest of these wizards coughed gently, and he said, "I have always been to the front in private enterprise. I yield in public spirit to no man. I think yours is a very good idea, a capital idea, and not too costly. But it seems to me that the cause for which we fought is again endangered. What more fitting memorial for the fallen than that their children should fall for the same cause?" Rushing eagerly into the street, the kindly old gentleman cried to the young, "Will you sacrifice through your lethargy what your fathers died to gain? The world must be made safe for the young." And the children went.
Well, you can't follow that with much, really, can you? Thank you very much for being a lovely audience and listening, except to say, I would like to say, I just thought of that then. In 1914 at Christmas time, when all those blokes got out the trenches and they met in the middle, you know, the big word "if" hangs there, doesn't it? But they just walked away, you know. Anyway, thanks to my friends. I've already introduced them at the start, and thank you very much for coming along. It's just a small insight into what was going on at that time. Thanks very much.